What's up, everybody, and welcome back to the Multidimensional Nerd. On this episode, I am actually re-releasing an old episode that I did back whenever this whole thing was still the Chad Garrett show. On this episode, it's called Rise a Night, and it's part of my breakdown and analysis of the movie Kingdom of Heaven, specifically the director's cut of it. I'm going to be actually doing another video, a fourth video on this, or episode on this, where I'm actually going to be splicing in scenes from the movie, and we're going to be talking about them and rehashing and like getting some of my new thoughts on these scenes, and you can actually hear how the actors portray the scenes rather than just having me read part of the script. So I'm really excited to get you guys into that. I think it's going to be really awesome. Make sure that you guys like and subscribe and enjoy the rest of this episode, and I will see you again in the next one. Today we start with a story. Godfrey, looking ragged, stands over Balian by sheer force of will. He looks down at his son and delivers the oath. Be without fear in the face of your enemies. Be brave and upright that God might love thee. They come as a whisper, though sweat pours from Godfrey as though he is shouting. Speak the truth, always, even if it leads to your death. Safeguard the helpless, and do no wrong. That is your oath. From his knees, Balian accepts his father's ring, the mark of the Baron of Ibelin. The sting of his father's backhand lingers. And that is so you remember it, Godfrey says, collapsing into his chair. Hospitalier hands the sword of Ibelin to Godfrey. With shaky hands and a tired look, Godfrey presents the blade to Balian. Arise, a knight and Baron of Ibelin, Hospitaller says. As Balian stands, Godfrey loses strength. He falls forward almost out of his chair, only to be caught by his son. Balian eases Godfrey back into the chair as Godfrey clasps his son's face in sweat-soaked palms. Defend the king. If the king is no more, protect the people. Godfrey releases Balian and slumps against Hospitalier. As Balian stands, Godfrey's eyes stare longingly, lovingly, tiredly up at him. It is now time, my lord, to confess to holy God, not your son, Hospitalier says. Are you sorry for all of your sins? Still staring after Balian, Godfrey replies, for all but one. When the words fade, Godfrey's eyes fall from Balian. His head slumps against Hospitalier, and a sigh escapes his lips. Godfrey de Ibelin, knight, lord, friend, father, is dead. Today we talk about honor, chivalry, and strength. Today we talk about conscience and tragedy. Today, we talk about the Kingdom of Heaven. I'm Chad Garrett, and this is the Chad Garrett Show. Okay, so I might have lied at the beginning. It's not just today. We're actually starting a series on Ridley Scott's epic movie, The Kingdom of Heaven, specifically the director's cut, because it's a movie that deserves a series. If there is anything even close to a modern epic, Ridley Scott nailed it. Written by William Monahan, Kingdom of Heaven, the movie starring Orlando Bloom, and it has Liam Neeson playing Godfrey, is absolutely wonderful. It is also the greatest tragic tale that I have seen in modern history, in modern memory. There are so many true tragic characters in this whole story, and I not only think that that's intentional, I think that it is beautifully captured, and I'm going to try and explain some of that tragedy that people might otherwise miss. in this first episode. And then in our next episode, we'll talk about some eternal truths that happen. And then in our third episode, we'll talk about the crux of the movie, and that is very much its commentary on faith. But as I said before, we're going to talk today a lot about story, and specifically the tragedy that is contained in this story. But it's not tragedy like what you think it is, right? Your dog gets run over in the street, that's a tragedy, right? It's a sad thing. Everyone equates tragic to sad. Tragedy in its truest sense, in the Greek sense, is where you have two things that shouldn't be true, but they are. And oftentimes you have to make a choice between these two things. There's a story in Greek history about a mother that kills her husband, and the son is faced with this idea of this conflict where he must avenge the death of his father, but then he finds out that it was his mother that killed his father. And there's another truth that you should honor your mother and you shouldn't kill your mother. So he has to make this choice. How do I avenge my father, but still stay true to the principle that I should not kill my mother? Because the two cannot be true at the same time. Because if he were to avenge his father, then he has to kill the mother. But if he doesn't kill his mother, then he hasn't avenged his father. Okay, that's one example. Another great example is with Achilles. In the Iliad, Achilles gives his life to be remembered for eternity in glory. And when we see him again by a different author, Virgil, in the Aeneid, Rome's great epic poem, we meet Achilles in hell, right? In Hades. And Achilles says that he would rather live 100 years a slave than be the king of all the damned. And some people claim that this is contradictory because it counteracts his sacrifice to have his name entrenched in glory, enshrined in glory for all of eternity. In reality, it doesn't, because he had no idea what Hades would have been like. And had he gone his whole life and still ended without the glory and then ended up in Hades, then I guarantee you that his character would have said, I wish I would have gotten the glory while I had it. But now that he has given his life for the glory and he realizes how precious life actually is, he says the opposite. And so there are these two conflicting themes that are going on that are both true at the same time. You can wish that you stayed alive and yet still have made the hard choice of giving your life for glory. We have three main characters that experience a ton of tragedy over the course of this story, and tragedy in the sense of the Greek sense, of the theatrical sense, of the literary sense of tragedy, not just tragedy as we understand it in the English language. The three characters that we are going to be focusing on in this movie are the tragedy of Godfrey, the tragedy of Balian, and the tragedy of Sebilla. Again, that's Godfrey, Balian, and Sebilla. Now, we haven't talked about Sebilla yet. We haven't been introduced, but in the intro, you got to meet both Godfrey and Balian, Balian being the main character, Godfrey being his father. And those are going to be our first two. And then as I tell the story of Balian and I talk about his tragedy, we will meet Sebilla. Okay, the tragedy of Godfrey will come first, right after I give a huge, huge thank you to all of you that are listening. This is going to be one of my favorite series. The Kingdom of Heaven is one of my favorite movies of all time, especially the director's cut. It really is just a different movie with so many plot holes that are filled from the theatrical release, but the theatrical release was my favorite movie for a long time, many, many years, since I was a wee young lad growing up and loving medieval times. And it was a great movie, but it was also a bloody movie. And what little boy doesn't like a bunch of action and blood? So thank you for joining me on this journey. And thank you to all of our subscribers. We just had a new subscriber sign up. Thank you, Glenda. You are amazing. And I cannot wait to have you along with this ride as well. If you want to join Glenda and our other subscribers, make sure that you head on over to patreon.com/Forerunner. That is patreon.com/Forerunner. We have a ton of exclusive goodies. We just released our first article with Lillian Merritt, who is the owner of Strength of Atlantis. There's a fine art company, and you get, as a subscriber, you get discounts on her exclusive limited edition prints. as well as access to articles, exclusive articles that she writes that talks about each of her different pieces in a deeper sense than has ever been shared before. We also have other amazing articles, bloopers, and everything else. And we are constantly working to bring new exclusive material to that side of things to make sure that you guys have all the value that you possibly can. We give our best stuff away for free, but there's still some amazing things over at Patreon. So make sure you guys go and check that out. If Patreon is not for you, leave us a review. Please, please, please go onto Facebook, go onto Apple iTunes, leave us a 5-star review, or at the very least, keep your bad opinions to yourself. Awesome. Let's talk about the tragedy of Godfrey. First of all, who is Godfrey? We've already covered that he is Balian's father, but what we didn't cover is he is also the Baron de Ibelin. Ibelin is a fortress city. It has about 1,000 acres. It is located in the land of Canaan or in the kingdom of Jerusalem, which is when this takes place. The story takes place in 1184 AD, so after Christ's death. Anno Domini, I believe it is what the actual Latin stands for. This is after the First Crusade, and we are in this time period where the Christian French kingdoms have their own kingdom in Jerusalem, and it's a different French king that is ruling there. Godfrey was the second son of a wealthy French noble. His elder brother is the baron of the area where Balian comes from. Godfrey left home in search of glory in the Crusades and found it and became the Baron de Ibelin. Was gifted the land of Ibelin by the king. And his connection to Balian isn't just that he is Balian's father. His connection to Balian is actually that Balian is his bastard son. So before he left for the Crusades when he was younger, he fell in love with the wife of the blacksmith, I do believe. And though he did not force himself on her, there were some. It's a complicated relationship that happened there. Because he was the Lord, she couldn't exactly say no, but at the same time, he did not force himself on her. It was a consensual relationship. Nevertheless, when Godfrey left for the Crusades, he left this pregnant woman behind. And it is implied through the story that Godfrey has a lot of guilt resting on him about having left his son there and having never had a relationship with his son. And all of this is based very loosely on real history. So I'm focusing all on the movie itself. Godfrey becomes one of the teachers and mentors of the present king of Jerusalem. And in this mentorship, we find out later that it was the king of Jerusalem that tells Godfrey to travel back to his home and find his son. That way he might have peace, and that way he might ask for forgiveness for having left his son and having never been there as a father. And this is where the story picks up. You have Godfrey riding in to his old hometown. He stays the night with his brother in the castle keep, and then the next day he goes and he approaches Balian, and he delivers a line, something to the extent of, something along the lines of this. They say that Jerusalem is the center of the world for asking for forgiveness. For me, it is right here, right now, with you. He's speaking here to Balian. And he goes on to explain who he is, how he knew Balian's mother, and that he is Balian's estranged father. Now, the first tragic moment for Godfrey hits now that we know who he is and why this is important. We have the first tragic moment because he has traveled from Jerusalem to France after being gone many years, all to ask for the forgiveness of his son that he never got to know. And Balian turns him away. It's actually quite heart-wrenching because the only way that he knows how to cope with this idea, you see the hurt and the pain in him, and you see him try and put it off as he actually becomes a little bit of a jerk, but you can understand why. He just traveled all this way after carrying this guilt with him for all of these years, and Balian just says, no. And then Godfrey tells him, if you want anything from me, ask of it now. Balian says, I want nothing. And Godfrey goes to leave back for Jerusalem, to return to the land of Canaan, to his castle in Eblan. Okay. It is after Godfrey leaves that Balian comes riding behind him. And it turns out that Balian has committed murder. At the campsite they make camp at, the sheriff of the town that Balian is from, we never know the name of this particular town, so that's why I just keep calling it the town. The sheriff, who is also Godfrey's nephew, shows up and says that he needs to take Balian back so that he can face up for the crime of the murder that he committed. And we'll talk about the murder in a little bit with Balian, because it's a really tough thing. But what I want to focus on here is the fact that the nephew asks for Balian to come along with him to go and face trial for his crimes and face punishment for his crimes. And Godfrey's first answer is, well, we're all murderers. Right? Everyone that's in that camp is a murderer because they all come from Jerusalem. They've all fought in the Crusades. They've all murdered people. They all have a guilty conscience in that own way. And it's when the sheriff presses the matter, Balian tells Godfrey they have a right to take me. And Godfrey turns around and looks at his own nephew, right? Like the fact that he is this nephew, this is what makes this point tragic. In the theatrical version, you don't get this. In the director's cut version, you do. He looks at his nephew and says, of those that will die here today, you will surely be among them. Now, here we have a tragic moment. You have a man that wants to have a relationship with his son. You have a truth, an eternal truth, that a man should have a relationship with his son. You also have another eternal truth that you should not kill your family member. And Godfrey is faced with a decision. If he doesn't kill his nephew, he will never have a relationship with his son. He will not be able to protect his son. It is also a father's duty to protect his son. And yet, if he protects his son, he must kill his own family. This is a tragic moment. And Godfrey makes the choice without a second thought. And it really speaks to the truth of his redemption, right? The truth of his repentance for having not been there with Balian, because he is willing to fight, obviously, for a chance to have a relationship with his son. And now we know that he is willing to kill, and not just kill, but kill his family in order to have a relationship with his son. And after the fight, so in the fight, Godfrey takes an arrow to the ribs, and he splits the head of his nephew. And in the midst of splitting the head of his nephew, he snaps the arrow and causes irreparable damage. And so now we have this moment. This is the thing that will eventually kill Godfrey. At the very beginning, I read to you the scene where Godfrey dies, and the last moment where he makes Balian the Baron to Eblan. The reason why Godfrey dies in that scene is because he takes on a fever, because the bone marrow enters the blood, and the only reason why his bone marrow enters his blood is because he snapped the arrow that was shot into him between his ribs. It was a clean shot. He snapped that arrow and broke the ribs himself in order to deal the killing blow to his nephew. And so now he has saved his son's life to try and have an opportunity to get to know his son. But in doing so, has given his own life up. This is the other tragic component, is that he is now on a highway to hell. He is going to die, and he did it all for a chance to have a few days with a son he never knew. That's true repentance. You want to talk about the ability to give your life for someone? That's true love. right? That is a fatherly love, to be willing to protect and fight and kill and die for those that matter most. So we fast forward and we get to see the death of Godfrey, and you get to see Balian. We're going to talk now about the tragedy of Balian, and we're going to rewind a little bit, because when the movie starts, Balian is actually in prison, and he is in prison because he is grieving. Now, this is a really weird thing. Why would you be put in prison because you are grieving? This is our first tragic moment with Balian. Balian's wife has committed suicide, and she has committed suicide because Balian's son died in his infancy. So the death of their child led his wife to grief so much that she commits suicide, and in Balian's own grief, he is imprisoned, and he's imprisoned because his grief is so rapturous, it's so strong, it has him in its clutches so hard that it is believed that he is possessed. Like, this grief is a demonic possession. And so in order to keep him from hurting himself or anyone else, they have to put him in this cell. Well, he's ordered out of the cell a little bit later, but that point is the idea that we talk about the tragedy. It is a truth, an eternal truth, that you should grieve for those that you truly love when they are lost, especially in a way that is so sad and disheartening as suicide and the death of a child. But in this culture, grieving is viewed as a sign of insanity or possession. So you must make a choice. Do you function in society and ignore your grief, which causes you to have to kill something human inside of you? Or do you accept the consequences of society and grieve anyway and be human in that moment? This is where we find Balian at the beginning of all this. He is already a tragic character. Well, then he's betrayed by his own brother. One of the people that had him imprisoned was a priest. The same man that buried his wife was Balian's own brother, a man of the cloth. He is one of the monks. And we find out that the brother desecrated his wife's body by having her beheaded. He took her pendant, from her silver cross pendant, which Balian crafted. It's assumed that Balian crafted this pendant for her, off of her neck. And he is also working behind Balian's back to try and get Balian to leave so that he can inherit his land. And so now when Balian is confronted by his brother, and his brother begins revealing all of this, hoping that it will drive Balian away. Everything except for the pendant. The pendant is the thing that drives Balian over the edge. Balian is confronted with this idea that he must avenge the desecration of his wife, the blatant disrespect showed toward his wife. Because back then, you have to understand that if someone was beheaded, it is believed that they could never enter heaven. And suicides were sent to hell anyway. So now she's not only in hell because she committed suicide, but she's now in hell headless. This is a massive offense to Balian. This is a massive offense to his wife. And it's done by his own kin. And so you're faced with this confrontation in Balian's heart where he has several eternal truths. One must not kill, first of all. That's one of the 10 commandments. One must not kill their brother, which is wrapped up into this whole thing. And one must not kill an ordained member of the church, right? So his brother is all of these things wrapped into one, and yet Balian has to make this choice of, do I avenge my wife, the desecration of my wife, or do I keep true to these things of not killing this clergyman who has done me so wrong? As I've already told you, Balian commits murder, and it's his own brother that he ends up killing. Fratricide, as it is called. And this leads Balian to not only know Godfrey, he chases down after Godfrey, thinking it's Godfrey's that Godfrey is his only hope of getting salvation for his wife, going to Jerusalem and getting salvation for his wife in hell. But it also provides him an opportunity to forgive Godfrey and learn who Godfrey is, because it is by learning who Godfrey is, and that moment of Godfrey making the choice to fight to protect his son, that really begins to earn Balian's trust. And by the time that Godfrey dies, Balian is actually not completely attached to Godfrey, but he is willing to honor his father's memory. He has enough respect and enough of a relationship with Godfrey in order to honor his memory later in the story. As much, he actually takes it as his maxim to do what his father said and to be a good knight. Later on, after Balian reaches Ibelin, so he goes to Jerusalem, prays for his wife, comes out of it, is commissioned by the king to go and be the Baron to Ibelin in the stead of his father. And this is where we get to meet Sebilla. Now, Sebilla is the king's sister. Very beautiful, very, very beautiful woman. She is presently wed to a Templar knight who is the leader of the Templar order, who Balian hates his guts, and he hates God. And this guy, his name is Guy. Guy de Lusignan. Guy hated Balian's father and therefore also hates Balian, and Balian becomes a thorn in Guy's side. Guy is this religious fanatic willing to go to war all in the name of God wills it, right? I put that in quotations, and we'll talk about that later on in the series. It's very obvious that there's an attraction between Sebilla and Balian early in the relationship. What's even more damning to this tragedy, though, is that Balian chooses to live by a code of honor and a code of virtue. He tries to be a good knight, but he allows his despising, for lack of a better word, of Guy, Sebilla's husband, to get the better of him, and he forsakes his virtue for Sebilla. Sebilla goes and visits Balian at De Ibelin, or I should say Ibelin, not De Ibelin. That means the Ibelin. She goes and visits Balian at Ibelin and stays with him for a season. And in doing so, they become very close, and they do end up having an affair. And Balian realizes in this time that he's spending with her that he does love her, but he doesn't quite see her for who she is yet. And we will get to why that is, because that is part of Sebilla's tragic character as well. But she's also attractive. She's the queen, and she gives him a chance to spite his enemy. And so you have on one hand, do I keep my virtue or do I love a woman? And this is a battle that, though it is tragic, and we know the answer is you should keep your virtue, right? Everyone knows the answer is keep your virtue. And yet how many of us, if we were put in Balian's position, could say no to this beautiful woman, this queen that has decided to love us and that we not only find attractive, but we also believe that we love in return. And it only comes as a bonus that we get to spite our enemy by doing it. And so for all of the wrong reasons, Balian allows himself to go through with this. And it's a thing that plays well for Sebilla's character later on, because Balian does get a chance at redemption. Not many tragic characters get their chance at redemption for something like this. Balian does. We'll talk about that next, because the very next thing that I want to talk about is actually how Balian has the opportunity to marry Sebilla. He has the opportunity to serve under the king. So Sebilla has a son, and when the king dies, Sebilla's son becomes ordained as the king. And one of the original king's dying wishes was for Balian to marry Sebilla if Sebilla were to be annulled of her marriage to Guy, because Guy was going to send the country to war if he had the first chance. Believing that the young boy that would inherit the kingship would be enough of a bulwark, and also believing that his ability to stand for his virtue, and now also seeing Sebilla for who she is. Seeing Sebilla for this queen that is willing to put herself above the law for no other reason than she is queen. This causes Balian to deny not only the king, but also his love for Sebilla. And he literally, this is where we get one of the greatest lines of the entire series, where he says that Jerusalem is a kingdom of conscience or a kingdom of nothing. And so he has to follow his conscience, because if he marries Sebilla, here's the other crux of this thing, is like, it's not just he's going to annul the wedding with Guy, is that if the marriage to Guy is annulled, Guy will be hung, and anyone that does not, any of the Templars that do not swear allegiance to Balian will also be hung. And so Balian, believing that the prince who is about to become king will be able to keep them from going to war, and also not wanting to be the cause of innumerable deaths, and seeing Sebilla for who she is, and thinking that she is above the law, not only of man, but of God. At one point and we'll talk about that in a second, I'm getting ahead of myself. He chooses not to marry her. And this leads us directly to the climax of the movie, where Guy gets control of the army and he leads them out against the forces of Salah ad-Din, and the entire army gets wrecked. And that's what leads Balian to being known today as the defender of Jerusalem. Even now, he is historically known as the defender of Jerusalem, and he was the one that saved the lives of the people when Salah ad-Din assaulted the city of Jerusalem in 1187. It was Balian that surrendered the city to him in order to save the lives of the inhabitants. You still with me? Hang in there. We're almost done, because we have one more tragic character that we want to talk about, because the story here is so good. We talk all the time about the narratives of our lives, and I hope that you can see not only just amazing writing in all of this. I really encourage you to go and see this movie for yourself, but I also really, really hope that you can see some of the tragic conflicts that happen in our own lives. Right? I'm doing my best to highlight these things, these truths of how we should act, these, and oftentimes Western values that we have that are at the core and crux of our society, and how we make things happen, how we write our laws, and how we interact as people. And they're so beautifully mirrored here. And because of fiction, we can see what happens when people make the right or wrong choices, where right or wrong choices have been otherwise made throughout history. Sebilla is arguably the most dynamic character. She has the greatest change throughout the course of the series. And she does so because she believes that the queenship that she holds, or the princess-ship that she holds, puts her above the law, even the 10 Commandments. There's a scene whenever she visits Balian and Ibelin, that she is washing Balian after Balian comes out of the fields from having worked the fields with his people. And she talks about how washing him is not adultery. And then she says, even if it was adultery, the commandments do not apply to people like us. It applies to those that are lesser. So here we already see that how the queenship has corrupted who she is, and corrupted her own value and virtue, and how she is in many ways an antithesis to who Balian is. And yet he falls in love with her anyway. And he forsakes his virtue anyway. He allows himself to be seduced into this idea that the 10 Commandments do not apply to him. That affair, and I think that scene, directly leads Balian to seeing who she is. It reveals to him her willingness to sell her soul for politics. We also see Sebilla being a tragic character in the case of her brother, who is the king. Her brother, the king, the reason why the king dies is because the king has leprosy. And before he is 30 years old, this king dies. And though she loves her brother desperately, we know this because we get to see her say a final farewell, she has not seen her brother in years because she could not stand to look upon his masked face. She could not stand to see what had become of him because of the leprosy. It broke her heart too much. And so she's faced with this tragic conflict. I love my brother. I want to talk with my brother. I miss my brother. I cannot handle the emotional, on the other side, I cannot handle the emotional damage of seeing him literally rot alive before my eyes, to smell his rotting flesh. Because that's what leprosy does. It's a bacterial infection that causes you to rot while you are alive. After she watches her brother die of this disease, though, she finds out that her 7-8-year-old son is also a leper. And so she is faced with another tragic choice. Does she allow her son to live and rot before her eyes? Or does she take her son's life slowly, easily in his sleep? She makes the choice to kill her own son. She slips a poison into his ear as he lays on her lap, and he passes quietly. And this is how we have Guy de Lusignan rise to power in the story, is because there is no longer a bulwark of her son to command the armies. Guy, her husband, that Balian would not replace, now commands the armies of Jerusalem, and he decides to go to war. At the end of it all, though, Balian delivers her a line. Balian tells her, "Decide not to be a queen, and I will come to you." This is after Jerusalem has been surrendered. And Sebilla says, "I'm still the queen of Acre and all of these other cities that are in the Middle East. How am I supposed, what am I supposed to do now? Do I go to them? Do I continue to rule over them?" And Balian tells her, "Decide not to be a queen, and I will come to you." And this is where we get Sebilla's dynamicism from, is because in one of the very last scenes of the movie, we see Sebilla walking. And Balian comes to her and says, "Queens do not walk, yet you are walking." And Sebilla grabs his hand. She realized at the end of it all, after seeing her city besieged, after losing her brother, after losing her son, after being married to a madman that drove the kingdom of heaven away, she finally realized that royalty means nothing without conscience. She realized that a queenship does not make her better than any laws of man. And at Baliam's prompting, she chooses to be a person, a human, a peasant, not a queen. It's a beautiful redemption story, although the tragedy that it takes to get there. But I tricked you, because there's a fourth one that I want to touch on briefly. And that is our antagonist, Guy de Lusignan. And I'm probably butchering the latter part of that name, but there's a tragedy that happens with Guy that I feel needs to be brought up because it has Balian deliver the end of his conflict and the end of his tragedy, has Balian deliver the best line in the entire movie. So Guy takes control of the armies, leads them to their death. Then Salah ad-Din looks at Guy and says, a king does not kill a king. And so what they do instead is that during the siege of Jerusalem, the Muslims strip him nearly naked and put him on a donkey, and they parade him around the cities of Jerusalem. They parade Guy around the cities of Jerusalem. And Balian, Guy has now tried to kill Balian. Guy has insulted Balian. Guy has insulted Sebilla, who Balian loves in many ways. He has taken many of Balian's friends and taken them out to war where they have died, including Hospitalia, who we have heard of many a time now, who is one of Balian's mentors. All of these people are dead because of Guy. And then after Balian surrenders the city of Jerusalem, before Balian is able to leave the city, Guy confronts him and they have a sword fight with no armor, no nothing. And Balian bests him. And Guy is on his knees, having been humiliated, having lost everything that was ever given to him because of his pride, his selfish desire, and his religious fanaticism. Balian takes the stance of swordship that his father taught him. It was a high guard, it was the guard of the hawk, and is getting ready to strike Guy down. He has every reason to, and decides not to. And this is the line. Balian looks at him and says, when you rise, if you should rise a knight. And this is wild because Guy has been a king now. Guy has been the leader of the Templars, an order of knights. Guy has been the lord of the land of the Roussillon. He's been all of these things in title, and yet his actions never once reflected the oath that Balian took, that Balian administered on those that helped him defend the city of Jerusalem. And so it doesn't matter. The point of this is that it doesn't matter what title you hold. You can call yourself a leader, and if no one's following you, you're just taking a walk. The title isn't what matters. It is your actions and how you conduct yourself daily. It is the maxims that you hold yourself to. It is the oaths that you take and how you stay true to them. And so if there is one thing, if you forget everything else that we have talked about today, there is one thing that you pick from this episode, take this. Find an oath. Take a maxim. Live by it. Don't rest on titles. Act. And when you rise, if you should rise a knight. I'm Chad Garrett. This is The Chad Garrett Show.